All right, so we're diving into this teen self-help book. And I gotta say, it's not every day you see a teenager writing the book on self-improvement.
Right. You kind of have to wonder what a 16-year-old could teach us.
And they know some people are probably thinking that like, okay, what's a teenager gonna tell me about life?
Exactly. And instead of trying to downplay their age, they really lean into it.
It's true. They actually talk about how they haven't lived through decades of, you know, harsh reality or whatever. But
But they flip it around and say, hey, being a teenager today comes with a whole other level of pressure.
that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way. What are some of the pressures they're talking about?
Well, they call being a teen this constant state of becoming, which I think is a really interesting way to put it.
It makes sense, though. You're constantly changing and like growing, and then you add in all the emotional stuff on top of that.
And the social pressure. They give this example of teenagers feeling stuck between listening to their parents and trying to fit in with their friends.
Oh, totally. That's so relatable. Even as an adult, sometimes you're like, who am I supposed to listen to?
And it's not just about social stuff either. They talk about the pressure to get good grades and figure out your future career and all of that.
It's like this constant expectation to have it all figured out when you're still just trying to figure out who you are.
Exactly. And the author brings up this really important point about how teenagers don't always feel comfortable talking to adults about this stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh,
Like when you're a teenager, who do you even turn to when you're feeling lost?
Well, they argue that traditional education doesn't really equip teenagers with the tools to deal with these real world issues.
What do you mean?
Like, we're talking about basic things like managing your time, dealing with stress, navigating relationships, that kind of thing. Schools focus so much on academics that sometimes they miss out on these essential life skills.
So they're saying schools are prepping them for exams, but not for actually living.
Pretty much. And as if that wasn't enough, then you add in the internet.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other beast.
Right. It's like teenagers are already dealing with all this pressure, and then you throw in this constant stream of information, some of which is totally unreliable.
And it's not like they have a filter for all that.
Yeah.
They're still learning how to process information and figure out what's true and what's not.
So you have this situation where teenagers are facing these really complex issues, and they're kind of left to figure it out on their own.
Which I guess leads to the question, why write a self-help book? Like, what's the 16-year-old solution?
Well, the author seems to think that teens need advice from someone who gets it.
Yeah.
Someone who's actually going through those teenage experiences right now, not some adult looking back from decades away.
That makes sense. They're trying to bridge that gap between generations.
Yeah. And they even point out how most self-help books are written for adults who are in a totally different stage of life.
So it's like they're filling a void, offering guidance from a peer perspective. But how do they actually structure the book? Is it just a random collection of tips, or is there a method to it?
Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. They actually divide the book into these three sections, almost like building blocks.
Building blocks. Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So the first section they call fundamentals.
Fundamentals. Makes sense.
Yeah.
What kind of stuff do they cover in that section?
It's like the foundation of their whole approach. They talk about things like understanding your own perspective, challenging your beliefs, and cultivating a more positive outlook on life.
So before you even get to the how-tos of life, they want you to take a step back and examine your own internal compass.
Exactly. It's like they're saying before you can change your life, you need to understand how you see yourself and the world around you. And then they move on to the next layer, which they call qualities and values.
Okay, so this is where they start building upon those fundamentals.
Right. They shift the focus to things like taking action, being resilient, developing a strong sense of self, having the courage to pursue your dreams.
So it's less about specific skills and more about developing the right mindset.
Exactly. It's about the kind of person you want to be more than anything else. And then finally, they get to the practical stuff, what they call skills.
Ah, so this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
What kind of skills are we talking about here?
It's actually a really interesting mix. They cover everything from communication and problem solving to time management and even financial literacy.
Wow, that's quite a range. It's like they're trying to give their readers a crash course in adulting.
And what I find really effective is how they present all this information. They're not talking down to their audience or acting like they have all the
In fact,
answers.
it's more about sharing their own experiences and what they've learned along the way.
Exactly. They even admit that they're still figuring things out themselves, which
Right.
I think makes them even more relatable.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference when you feel like the person giving the advice actually gets you, you know? Like they're not just talking down to you from some pedestal.
Totally. And, the excerpts actually talk about how much teenagers hate it when adults try to do that whole, like, when I was your age
Mhm.
thing.
Ugh, don't even get me started. It's like you're speaking different languages.
Yeah.
But when you can find someone closer to your own age who understands those little things that you're going through, that's when you can really connect with the advice.
It's all about trust and connection, really, which makes you wonder, what kind of advice is the 16-year-old giving? What do they think is most important for teenagers to know right now?
I mean, we only have these excerpts, right?
Yep.
But based on what we've seen so far, there's a huge emphasis on self-awareness and, building a solid foundation for yourself and learning those practical life skills.
And we can't forget about embracing your individuality either. That seems to be a big theme for the author, like staying true to yourself even when you feel pressure to conform.
Absolutely. And, I think that's something we could all use a reminder of, sometimes even those of us who aren't teenagers anymore.
So true. It's like the more things change, the more they stay the same, you know?
Right.
Every generation has its own struggles, but that desire to connect, to learn, to grow, that's something we all share.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now we want to hear from you. What advice would you give your teenage self knowing what you know now? Head over to our social media and share your thoughts. We'd love to keep this conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.